Well, one of the first economic decisions that Arafat made following the signature of the Oslo Peace Accords was to privatize the telecommunications sector. It was a sector that required too much money and too much expertise, especially given that he had other priorities in terms of building a new Palestinian authority in the occupied territory. So I had saw that announcement in one of the papers in the States and actually tracked down who the investors were that he was speaking to. And there were four major investors. I found one of them, and to make a long story short, I was recruited as one of two persons to come back from the States. The other one was a Palestinian at the World Bank who was a telecom expert, who today is leading the Palestine Investment Fund and is also the economic advisor to the president. We came back and we basically set up the company from scratch on behalf of the investors. So we were part of the privatization effort, but from the private sector side. The reason I wanted to come back and work in telecom was multiple reasons. One is I wanted a soft landing to be able to return to Palestine to do something hands-on, especially given that the Oslo Accords, although I knew they didn't end the occupation, I felt that they gave enough openings to be able to start changing the reality. And for better or for worse, it had a time limit on it. It was a 5-year agreement, so I thought by the end of the 5 years, the occupation would have ended, so I could have dealt with anything that would have come to me for 5 years. That's one. The second is, I wanted to be able to do something in my field, because I didn't feel that I can come and contribute really in a serious way doing something outside of my profession. So building the first telecommunications company was very close to my studies and my interests. And also, it was a national project. It was something that was part of building the infrastructure for a state. So I actually read Article 36 of the Oslo Accords, which is the article that dealt with telecommunications. And from there, came back, set up shop here, and worked in telecommunications until the company went operational, which took us about 3.5 years to do.
Can you tell us a bit about the difficulties that you faced in doing this, like in terms of the occupation?
Sure. I mean, the first thing one should look at is the first sentence of the principles within Article 36. It's very similar to other articles within the annexes of the Oslo Accords. The first sentence is great. It says the Palestinians have the right to build, operate, and maintain an independent telecommunications network, as well as television network and otherwise. So the first sentence gave us the right to do what we needed to do to build this part of Palestinian future infrastructure. It's the next 1,500 words which were all the buts. Everything we needed to be able to actually do it, for example, right-of-way, telecommunication frequencies, the right to import goods, the ability to tap human resources to come back and actually work in this field, which is new to Palestine at the time, was totally given to the Israelis unilaterally. So they decided alone if Palestinians were to get frequencies or not, if Palestinians were allowed to recruit people from outside the country or not, if we were able to even import equipment to be able to build the network or not. And the first lesson was that Oslo was, I believe, written in a way to set us up for failure. In telecom, it didn't fail, but it didn't fail not because of Oslo. It didn't fail because it was a monopoly at the time, and telecom, by the nature of its business, is a profitable business. So it can absorb a lot of constraints while we're building. Other sectors failed because they were written in very similar ways, but they didn't have the profit that telecom has in it. For example, water. So that was the first lesson, that Oslo wasn't made for us to succeed. The second is that in addition to the constraints that we can read about in Oslo and analyze, there were a whole level of constraints that Israel applied completely outside of the agreement. Things that really they did not have the right to do, but yet were very clearly constraining our ability to build the company. First and foremost was prohibiting us from being able to recruit Palestinian telecommunications experts from around the world to come back to the West Bank and offer their services to our company. And that was devastating because before the Oslo Accords, the entire telecommunications network was in Israeli military hands. So the universities were not producing telecommunication engineers. People did not have an experience in telecommunications. So when we had the right to build the company, the first thing we needed to do was to recruit people, Palestinians who have a vested interest in doing this, and Israel refused to provide a free access to these people to be able to come back. I was lucky because I was an American citizen and could come back as an American tourist for 3-month intervals. Every 3 months I had to leave the country. And very few people will do that, to disrupt their life without a permanent status here while they're trying to work. So that was another lesson. I guess a third lesson was that, and we learned this after we took over the details of the company, that telecommunications was used by the occupation as a tool of coercion. When we took over, there were something like 200,000 people on a waiting list wanting a fixed telephone. We're talking about 1995, 1996, 1997. And it took us less than 6 months to make the waiting list zero. Because it was not an issue of not having infrastructure or not having the ability to lay cables for inside the cities having fixed telephony. It was a matter that the Israelis were using getting a telephone or not getting a telephone as a way to force the population into working with them throughout the years of the occupation prior to Oslo. So that was also something that was very eye-opening, that Israel was really using every single resource it had in its hands, telecommunications being one of them, to force the community to become basically collaborators. And that was a political eye-opener for me of how deep the Israeli occupation went and to what strides it went to basically break the community, to break the solidarity within the community.
So there's 200,000 people in the late 90s who didn't have a landline.
Who applied for a landline, but the Israelis had refused to give them a landline. So they became on a waiting list, waiting for a telephone.
Right.
A house has no telephone.
Right.
They want a telephone, they make an application. And at the time, the Israelis were deciding who gets a telephone and who doesn't.
Right.
So over time...
and the infrastructure was all there.
Inside the cities, the infrastructure was here. Mm-hmm. And that's another lesson, I would say, because the infrastructure was not only here, but it was rather good infrastructure. Why? Because Israel is one of the producers of telecommunication equipment. And for us, this was a captive market. The occupied territory was a captive market to the Israeli occupation. So they used the tax monies that they were collecting from Palestinians in the occupied territory to fund the purchase of Israeli technology to be installed here. So for them, they had no problem investing in telecommunications. It was our tax dollars that they were taking, and they were buying their own equipment. So in a way, we were like a testing laboratories for Israeli technology industry. And that's another eye-opening experience. And we felt even afterwards that they had a hard time letting that go. When we came as a private company working with a proper structure, we had tenders, global tenders for our equipment, and we preferred non-Israeli equipment if we were able to. And when we did want to purchase things from outside of Israel, they just blocked them at the borders. Because you cannot get a piece of equipment into the occupied territory unless you cross an Israeli border. Just like you can't physically reach the occupied territory unless you cross an Israeli manned border. So they had full control on this economy, and they micromanaged it to the nth degree for the sake of serving their own industries and for the sake of putting pressure on us so we can't really develop a real economy. So it was a micro-managed effort of a military occupation to make sure the Palestinians did not have the ability to create a new reality on the ground.
But you managed to get through that anyway because the profit margin is so high.
This partly because the profit margin was so high, we were able to make this happen even though of all the constraints. But it's not 100%. I'll give you an example. The most money in telecommunications is made by international calls, of course. To be able to reap the benefits of international calls, you need something called a gateway. Every country has one. It's a big computer. All the telephone calls from around the world come through that big computer and into your country. Israel refused to allow us to have a direct connection with the outside world. They forced upon us in the Oslo Agreement that every single international call has to go through a duly licensed Israeli operator. So they locked in some of the business in the Oslo Agreement. After a few years, we appealed to the Israeli side through our ministry to be able to allow us to install a gateway so we can benefit from a full-fledged network, not only a domestic network. And after several years of back and forth, they came back with a very sly proposal. And they said, you can have a gateway if you want it, but you also have to follow one condition. And the condition was that you have to exclude East Jerusalem from your telecommunications network. And we just laughed that away because the Palestinians are not going to sell their political rights for a little bit more profit in telecommunications.
Can you talk a bit about the frequency and how they control the frequency? Oops.
Yeah, I mean, the frequencies are a very important component of how Israel has been micromanaging our ability to develop the telecommunications sector and thus to develop our economy. To be able to build a mobile network, the key resource is electromagnetic spectrum. The key resource is electromagnetic spectrum, its frequencies. And the best way to look at it is as if it's lanes in the air. And to develop a proper network in Palestine, let's say for the sake of discussion that you needed 6 lanes in the air to be able to make this network work. After a lot of haggling back and forth, the Israeli side, because they are the unilateral decision makers in giving or not giving the Palestinians the resources they need, they came back and gave the Palestinian side, let's say, a lane and a half. That doesn't mean you can't create the network. It means that your cost to do so is 4 times greater because you need more towers and you need more infrastructure. So even though we had international consultants, we had all the documentation proving that a properly set up network would require X amount of resources called frequencies, they refused to give them to us. And that happens even till today. So while you're sitting in Ramallah, you are getting a signal from all the Israeli operators that are not licensed in the Palestinian Authority. They can provide that service because they have all of the infrastructure. These Israeli companies have their infrastructure placed in the settlements that are on the mountaintops throughout the West Bank. So they're illegally providing telecommunication services to the entire West Bank. Whereas the Palestinian side is given the least amount of frequencies possible to create a network, and also we are given unpreferential treatment in terms of being able to have the needed frequencies, because frequencies come in different flavors. For example, for a smartphone network, you need something called 3G, which is allowing the internet to work on mobile telephony. Israel refuses to release that resource over the West Bank to us. Yet, they allow all of their companies, all 3 major Israeli companies, to have a 3G frequency, and thus they provide that service to the entire West Bank. It's a dumping market that they're able to reap a huge profit from without being registered, without having any kind of environmental oversight, without having any kind of taxation within the occupied territory, but yet they're benefiting from the Palestinian user because of their policy of not allowing the Palestinians to build their own network. This is a blatant violation of the Oslo Accords, if anyone still respects those accords.
It's hard, isn't it? That they keep on being referred to when when they didn't do what they were supposed to do with them, and yet everyone still refers to them. It's a bit like the Bible, I find.
There's another component that you might want to keep in mind.
Okay.
When you want to build a telecommunications network, you need to import equipment. And when you're importing equipment, as I noted, you need to we as Palestinians can only bring in equipment through Israeli borders. I recall a case where we were ordering the exact same equipment from Ericsson that the Israeli operator was ordering from Ericsson. The equipment came on the same shipment. It took less than a couple days. The Israelis got their equipment released from customs. Ours sat there for 2.5 years. It was outdated by the time we got it. This is one way the Israeli government hampers our ability to be able to build our network. And the footnote to that is, in the meantime, the Israeli companies are laughing all the way to the bank because they're having a high-tech, state-of-the-art network, and with this infrastructure that's placed in the settlements, they can provide all that service to the Palestinian community as well.
I'd like to move into the division of the Palestinian, the SIM card thing that I talked about. I'm not quite sure how to approach it other than to say that I thought that there might be an intelligence in keeping people from actually communicating together. This was where I came from.
The issue is, for Palestine to be able to create a proper network, we need this international gateway. And we have the company has the investment to do it and has the technical knowledge to install it. The only thing required is the Israeli approval to do so. When they don't approve it, of course, and when they don't approve an international gateway, it means that we don't have even our own numbering plan. The numbering plan within the telecommunications network here is a subset of the Israeli numbering plan. So we're still intricately tied to the Israeli network, even though Oslo gave us the right to build an independent network with our own numbering plan, with our own frequencies. Israel refuses to take actions to allow that to materialize. Now, when they don't give our own numbering plan, when they don't give enough frequencies so that we can properly have coverage throughout the entire West Bank and Gaza, and of course, in Oslo, they prohibit us from providing telecommunication services in East Jerusalem. That's a problem because a couple 100,000 Palestinians live in East Jerusalem, and many of them commute back and forth between the West Bank towns of Bethlehem and Ramallah. They either work here or they come here for business, but they live in East Jerusalem. In order for a Palestinian in Ramallah, if I wanted to make a call to Jerusalem, the cost is very, very high. So you find many Palestinians will be carrying 1 or 2 or 3 cellular phones with them, depending on where they are, using the phone that makes the most sense. If you're in East Jerusalem, you cannot get coverage from a Palestinian mobile. So you're forced to use an Israeli company's mobile. And that creates a artificial wall, a barrier, a cost barrier, and a headache for people to be able to have smooth communications. This is important as well because when I say that the Israeli operators are operating in our market, we're talking about 2 very different markets. Israel is a hyper-competitive market with a very high per capita income. We are a nascent economy with a very, very low donor-driven foundation. So when Israel is able to provide services here, untaxed, unregulated, they're able to dump in our market very cheap services compared to our own national operators. That's another reason that people have multiple phones, because although they understand the need for us to be able to build our national capacity in telecommunications, in such a depressed economy, people are also looking how to save a buck. And they will use the Israeli network when it makes financial sense for them to do so. So this is why you have this complication of some telephones work in some areas and some don't in other areas, and you have Palestinians all around their belt with different kinds of telephones. It's a rather sad reality given this world of interconnectiveness that everything should be more convergence than separation. But they have forced, the Israeli side has forced upon the Palestinian consumer to make a hard decision. Use your own national network, which is weak because we're making it weak, or use our network, even though it's unregulated and we don't pay taxes, but we'll give you a better service.
It's true. And I mean, it's not just about a better service. In some places, it's about service.
Yeah, some places you don't have coverage.
Yeah.
Especially in the rural areas. And that's all linked to the Palestinian companies, there's 2 now, not being allocated enough frequencies to create the network in a proper way.
Is it fair to think that, I don't know about the price differences, but is it like overseas? calling?
No, it's not. It's less, but it's still very expensive.
Yeah.
Because someone calling from Ramallah to a village around Ramallah, it should be a very local related call. Here, because the frequencies are not enough, the Palestinian company can't cover that village. So the village is fully covered by Israeli operators. So we end up speaking from a Palestinian operator to an Israeli operator, and that jacks the price up. It's a market that's being raped economically by Israeli economic concerns. Again, without taxation, without regulation, without environmental oversight. It's a sad fact for a modern economy to be allowed to do that, especially when they're a member of the WTO and OECD and so forth.
Is there sorry, but I'll just push this one more time. Like, would you say that this division in technology, and this type of technology being the way people communicate now, so like once upon a time we communicated in a different way.
Right.
Now we communicate with cell phones, all of us. Would you say that this division actually deepens the division between the communication of people, Israeli people with Palestinian people and Palestinian people with Israeli people?
Absolutely. I mean, the division within people is multi-level. You have the physical division. You have the checkpoint system. You have an illegal wall that has been built between the two communities. That has stopped our physical movement to intermingle with Israelis, which I think detrimentally affected the ability for both sides to see the other as human. When there's a wall in between and one side basically is battering the other side into submission, there's a tendency for the communities to dehumanize each other. So that's the first level of physical separation. By making it harder and more costly for Palestinians to be able to communicate technology-wise, telecommunication-wise, they've also created another wall. This is a burden that's an economic one in allowing the communities to communicate with each other. And I should note that 20% of Israel, not the occupied territory, but 20% of Israel proper is Palestinian, Muslim and Christian. And many of those families have relatives in the occupied territory. So by creating this economic barrier, in addition to a physical barrier, the Israelis have also prohibited and separated families even from being able to communicate, not only physically, but also telecommunication-wise. And I can go on and on. There's many different levels to how they separate. There's one specifically in Jerusalem as well. Where Jerusalem is a separate case as well, because Israel applies a law on Palestinians in East Jerusalem that if they do not maintain a residency, something that the Israelis call a center of life test, a litmus test called the center of life. If they proclaim that your center of life as an individual is no longer Jerusalem, many times that's calculated by saying, have you stayed in the city consecutively for 7 years? If they say that's not your center of life, they can strip you of your Jerusalemite residency. So not only is it absurd that a Palestinian in 1948 who was in Jerusalem, all of a sudden after Israel was created, was given, or after 1967, after the occupation happened, was given a residency for his own city that he was born in, instead of a citizenship. Not only that, but additionally, if the occupier decides that you're no longer living your life around the Jerusalem reality, they will even strip you of your residency. And you become stateless, based on an administrative decision of the occupier. And it's a rather shrewd one, because it's one you can't take a picture of. It's one that happens below the radar of CNN. But it's devastating Palestinian lives. It's separating families. It's forcing people to be where they may not want to be because they don't want to lose their residency. So they think twice about going to the US to work, or going to Spain to study, or going for a sabbatical for several years, because the fear is when you come back to Jerusalem, the Israelis may say, you've been away long enough that we have proclaimed Jerusalem is no longer your center of life. Thus, you're no longer a Jerusalemite. These are the kinds of administration tools. I've actually written an article about it. I call it genocide by public policy. It's a public policy. It's debated in the Knesset, the Israeli legislative body, and it's passed by law, and it's implemented by a whole bureaucracy. Bottom line, it's causing ethnic cleansing to happen, not only in Israel proper, but even in parts of the occupied territory, Jerusalem being the first among them.
Okay. And can you add at all about the division with the technology, though, and the depth of the depths with which the occupation is dividing the people? Because the way I see it, if peace is to happen, it probably is going to happen from the bottom up. I'm like one of those kind of people. I believe that it will happen from the bottom up. And for it to happen from the bottom up, of course, people need to talk to each other. So the Israelis have to get fed up of the occupation at one point when it becomes too costly. And I don't know if this sounds terribly naive to you, but yeah, like the bottom-up movement, the BDS internationally, etc. So, but with the division of people communicating with each other, that's kind of killing even that dream.
Yeah, I mean, definitely it is. I mean, every barrier to communication that happens, whether it's based on technology or not, is one step further away from us being able to communicate about the conflict, so we can communicate our way out of the conflict. By separating us, by not allowing us to have a free mode of communication or interaction with the other side, Israel is instilling that we are being dehumanized, and that ultimately will come back to create an environment within Israel where they don't really care what happens on the other side of the wall. And I hear this all the time. But the separation is again, it's multi-level. It's a separation of people who are outside of the country not being able to come back. My father was born in the West Bank. Because he wasn't here in 1967, he cannot come back to live here. He can only come to visit as an American citizen. He's not a refugee. He's from the West Bank. He's not an item for the negotiations. Israel prohibits even West Bankers from returning to the West Bank. So there's many levels of what Israel does to make sure that we cannot communicate not only with the Israelis, but even with our own people. And as I noted with the telecommunications example, that we want to interact with Palestinians around the world. We want to give them a vested interest in helping us to rebuild a Palestinian society that can live in peace and security with Israel. That's not going to happen by itself. It requires people to do it. So when Israel prohibits us from having access to our own people, whether they're in Israel or whether they're in America, that's a rather sad reality, because they know very well without these kinds of resources, human resources being the most important, that progress is not going to be made. Another example with technology, and what we're looking at these days around the Arab world, is what the internet did in terms of amplifying a people's movement for change. When Israel does not give us frequencies to allow us to have, for example, there are many examples, this is just one, when they don't give us the ability to have a 3G network, then we don't have mobile internet access on our mobiles, then that does not allow us to have the same kinds of tools that are available to the mass movements today in Tunis, in Egypt, in Syria, in Bahrain, and elsewhere. We would like to be able to empower our community with all the technology available in this world to be able to non-violently change our reality. By prohibiting us from having the resources to do that, technology and otherwise, what Israel is telling us is that the only way you can resist your occupation is violently. And I think they take a lot of happiness in seeing the Palestinian community violently resist the occupation. It's the only way they know how to be able to use it as an excuse to maintain the occupation. As the boycott, divestment, sanction movement moves forward, as the internal movement for civil rights inside Palestine becomes more articulate, the powers to be have a much more difficult time understanding how to deal with it. What I would like is the technology available to the world, available to the Israelis, to be available to us, so we can empower our population to act non-violently. We want to be able to provide the Palestinian community with all the technology available in Israel and in the region for us to be able to make change on the ground nonviolently. And that requires technology, it requires access to communicating with the other side, to be able to make an argument instead of to make a bomb. It also requires us to have full access to the media. And I think by having these kinds of tools available to us, we should be able to make an appealing case to our occupier that this is not in their benefit to continue. However, when they create the barriers, when they create the walls, when they make it more difficult for the two sides to communicate, it's really serving a continuation of the occupation by dehumanizing our community in the eyes of the Israelis, and vice versa in a way.
Yeah, and would you say too that although there's this dehumanization going on, it seems quite, and there's a nurturing of racism. It nurtures racism. Racism, I see it as a virus. We're all vulnerable to it, and the Israelis are a real experiment that we know the result of, because these experiments have been done before. So, but in a way, like as far as the paternal aspect of law, the Israelis are really not caring for their people. And I'm wondering if you have an opinion on who is really benefiting from this occupation.
That's a good question. I mean, I think there's a lot of people benefiting from the occupation. I think, and this may apply to both sides of the conflict, the status quo is serving a lot of different communities very well. For example, it's serving the Israeli private sector rather well. 70 to 75% of our economy comes from products and services from Israel. So there are many, many businesses in Israel would like things to stay just like they are because they're making money off of this captive audience called the occupied population. There's an entire peace industry which is benefiting greatly from the continued conflict. Everything from five-star hotels to restaurants to meeting venues to airplane trips to you name it. It's an industry. It's called here an industry. A lot of people would love to have this continued industry talking about peace because it's serving their economic benefit. There's also a huge interest from the donor community. For every dollar that the donor community invests into Palestine, I think it's something like 2/3 of that go back to the donor country, if not more. So we're benefiting very, very little from the amount of monies that are coming in. The donor countries are the benefiters of their own donations because they invest in Palestine and they hire their own experts, they buy their own equipment to send to us. So in a way, we're like a mini market for every time a donor gives us funds. So there are many pockets of the community that are fine with the status quo. I would say, and as a business developer, that the status quo is unsustainable. And they just need to look beyond their nose and they can probably see that this is going to collapse. And when it collapses, all sides, even the pockets that are happy today that they're making a benefit from this occupation, are going to find failure. Finally, the World Bank, in their last report 10 days ago, said it in black and white, that this economy is unsustainable. That's the first time I heard it so bluntly coming from such a conservative organization. Unsustainable status quo is not serving anybody at all, especially the two populations at large. And that's why our appeal is not to an Israeli government, it's to the Israeli people. If you're serious about wanting to create a democratic state called Israel, you must end this occupation. Because as someone said in Haaretz yesterday in an article, that Israel is now at a deciding point. They must decide between peace or a racist state. They've already taken several steps towards the racist state. If they continue on their existing path, they will, I believe, be unsustainable in the long term, but definitely be racist in the short term. And that's a big word to swallow for a community that has been victimized itself in history. And I think they would be very smart to think now of how to bring about peace given there's nothing left other than saying that you're accepting an apartheid reality of a majority of Palestinians between the sea and the river that's controlled by a minority of Israelis. That's not sustainable.
Yeah. Do you work much in Israel? Do you talk to Israelis much?
I used to talk much more when I was able to travel back and forth, but after I got my Palestinian residency, I became part of the collective security threat. So although I studied at Tel Aviv University, today I can't reach Tel Aviv University. Although a third of my client base was in Jerusalem, I cannot access them anymore because I now am a Palestinian resident from the West Bank. Whereas I used to use the Israeli airport to go and come, now I'm like the rest of the West Bank residents. All of us have only one exit point that we're allowed to leave from, which is a bridge in Jericho towards Jordan. So the restrictions on our movement, as I said, are multi-layered, and the collective punishment that happens daily. So and I talk much less now. I actually apply for Israeli permits to be able to go for one day to Jerusalem or to Israel, most of the times to speak, if I'm invited by an Israeli organization. But that's far and few in between, and it's a headache to do so because even if I get a permit to go to Israel, I must pass through a very humiliating checkpoint, which is more like an animal stall to be able to get out of the West Bank. So at every turn, Israel has made it almost impossible for the average Palestinian in the West Bank or Gaza, especially Gaza, to even talk to an Israeli, let alone interact and hopefully move things forward collectively.
Do you have an opinion on I get this feeling, and I don't know if I'm just getting overexcited about something, but that there's a military-industrial complex that the occupation serves by there's huge money coming from America into Israel and right back into America in terms of what are they called, Raytheon and some Lockheed and Martin.
Israel has become, post 9/11, by design, one of the world's leading suppliers of military and security related technology. If you go to the UK subway, you will find the camera monitoring system with an Israeli technology in it. If you go to the wall being built between Mexico and the US, you'll find Israeli contractors building it. If you go to most of the airports in the world, you will find Israeli security consultants and Israeli X-ray equipment. This is producing for Israel an industry that's not only very sexy these days given the state of world affairs, but it's also a very profitable one. And the reason, or one of the reasons that they're able to perfect their technology and to become a leader in this security military supply chain is because they have a laboratory called the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. And in that laboratory, they're able not only to test new weapons, but they're able to develop very sophisticated methods of control. For example, the ID system here is being very, very developed in terms of how can this military occupation ID system be used in a civil environment. On the checkpoints that you're seeing when you're riding around the West Bank, the camera systems which are actually reading the license plates of the cars approaching the checkpoints and going to a database and cross-checking that against any kind of blacklisted license for them to start. All of this is being used here in a military occupation frame, but being developed in Israeli laboratories to be marketed to a global world who is very interested these days in security. So Israel has this laboratory that the world has allowed them to operate in with a free hand, and they're able to apply all of these technologies. In Gaza, the recent onslaught a couple years ago in Gaza was the best example. New kinds of weaponry, new kinds of missiles, new kinds of phosphorus bombs, new kinds of armored vehicles, all of it was tried on this armless population, for the most part, civilian population, free-handedly. And I think that's why Israel was claimed as having war crimes in its portfolio of how it approached Gaza and how it's approaching the West Bank. And they don't really care because the international community have given them the blank check to continue to operate in their old mode of operation, which is heavy-handed military occupation. So yes, all of this ability for Israel to be able to create from this military occupation economic sectors, economic interests that better the state of living inside of Israel makes the continuation of occupation something that might even be desired in Israel.
Right. May I debate, though, that it's actually, is it a better style of living for Israel? And when I say that, I'm not being kind of, oh wow, like they really should be free people. But is it better, or is it better for 18 families that own 60% of the wealth in Israel? I mean, apparently...
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. I believe there's both of what you said is true. I think that, in a way, the Israeli economy is in a state of affairs which it's serving, for the most part, the population at large. The per capita income in Israel has risen collectively. Of course, those reaping the most benefit from having relations with this occupation are a handful. Those that are deeply involved in supplying specific products, for example. But the profit of that relationship of Israeli companies with the occupation, in a way, spreads around in Israel to the point where they can enjoy a high per capita income, health services that are par none in the region, an education system that's par none in the region, and for the most part, security, a level of security that's more than acceptable. Especially after the wall was created, they feel that they can manage the conflict now instead of resolve it. And that's a very serious place to be. Because if Israelis start to believe that managing the suppression of an entire nation is okay, then they're going to be very surprised when the Palestinian nation rises up yet again to turn the table on the military occupation, which would be detrimental to every Israeli livelihood, every Israeli life. We had two intifadas. Both of them came when our economy inside the occupied territories was on a rise. So the issue of feeding Palestinians more and they'll be quiet is not the right equation. It doesn't work. It failed twice. What we're looking for is our emancipation. We need our freedom and independence. And every time Israel thinks that it can manage the conflict instead of resolve it, every time they think that as long as their lives in Tel Aviv are normal and moving on, everything is okay, they're going to be in for a surprise. Because at the end of the day, suppressing an entire people cannot be sustained. And I would hate for violence to pick up again, for Israelis to see the cost of their occupation in blood. I would much rather have the opportunity to communicate with Israelis, explain and argue and try to make a case that being an occupier forever doesn't work. Just like being in charge of the apartheid forever didn't work. But with the mode of separation that Israel has gone into, I'm not sure they're giving us the ability to be able to even communicate with the Israelis. And this is something I'd like to make a point new. From 1967 up until they started building this wall, the Israeli mindset was a mindset of integration. They believed that the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem was part and parcel of the state of Israel. And they worked to try to incorporate as much as possible our economy, our society into theirs. When Sharon came to power in Israel and introduced the notion of separation, you see it in a wall, but there's many layers to the separation, as we were saying. The Israeli mindset started to shift to one that we don't really care what happens on the other side of the wall. We are no longer interested in integration, we're interested in separation. Having the goal of separation in such a small community, such a small country, where the natural resources don't understand separation, the water aquifers don't understand separation, the 20% of their population of Palestinians in Israel who have family members in the West Bank don't understand separation, is a policy that's also unsustainable in the long run. I don't think Israel can build a garrison state because the wall has two sides to it. And Israel has put itself in a position where it believes that it can remain being a Western state in the Middle East. The time has come for Israel to wake up, look around, and see that they exist in a society of the Middle East, and they need to become a player and a participant in the society they exist in. And that can't happen unless they remove the boot of occupation from the neck of Palestinians as a starting point. I mean, when I say the Israeli education system is high quality, I'm talking about access to education is free. So everyone has access to education, which is a very important indicator in all educational sectors. Also, they have some of the top, especially in technology, like the Technion, for example, in Haifa, is one of the best technology. It's the Israeli MIT in a way. But again, I speak from someone as an observer from outside. I mean,
yeah, because I think all of these things have got military
that's a separate issue.
funding
Yes, of course.
filtered in them, and it's not actually creating thinkers, and it's not actually creating bright. It's creating military people.
I wouldn't disagree with that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't disagree with that.
Yeah.
I would also agree that the U.S. education system is probably similar in terms of how industry has become maybe too much involved in the education system here or elsewhere.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I want to.
That serves you well?
It serves
sure?
me very well.
Okay.
And as usual with people like you, I like to go on and on, but I have to respect
That's okay.
your time.
I hope that worked out.
Yes. Thank you.
Alrighty.